Imagine two soldiers, one American and one German, sitting in foxholes on opposite sides of the same battlefield somewhere in France during the fall of 1944. Both men are cold, both are exhausted, and both are hungry. But when it comes time to eat, their experiences could not be more different. The American soldier opens a small cardboard box containing canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and instant coffee. The German soldier, meanwhile, is often lucky if he gets a piece of hard bread and a thin, watery soup made from whatever ingredients happen to be available that day. This difference was not an accident. It was the direct result of two vastly different industrial capacities, two very different logistical systems, and two militaries operating under dramatically different levels of strain by the middle years of the war. To understand why American soldiers generally ate so much better than their German counterparts, we have to start with the most basic factor of all, which is industrial production capacity. The United States entered World War II with an enormous, largely untouched industrial base. American factories, farms, and food processing plants were operating far from the front lines, safe from bombing raids, safe from invasion, and able to run at full capacity around the clock. This meant the United States could dedicate massive resources specifically to developing, producing, and shipping specialized combat rations designed to keep soldiers fed no matter where they were fighting, whether in the deserts of North Africa, the jungles of the Pacific, or the freezing forests of Western Europe. Germany, on the other hand, faced enormous strain on its food production almost from the very beginning of the war, and that strain only worsened as the conflict dragged on. German agriculture had been struggling even before the war due to labor shortages, and once millions of German men were pulled from farms and factories to serve in the military, food production at home took an immediate hit. Add to this the fact that Germany was fighting a two-front war for much of the conflict, stretching its resources thin across eastern and western fronts simultaneously, and you begin to see why feeding frontline troops became an increasingly difficult challenge for German military planners as the war progressed. Let's talk specifically about what American soldiers actually ate, because the variety and planning behind it was genuinely impressive for its time. The United States developed several different types of combat rations, each designed for specific situations. There was the C ration, which consisted of canned wet components like meat and vegetable stew, meat and beans, or meat and noodles, paired with a separate can containing crackers, sugar, instant coffee, and often a small chocolate bar or hard candy. Then there was the K ration, originally designed for paratroopers and soldiers who needed something lighter and more portable, which came in a small waxed cardboard box and included things like canned meat or cheese, crackers, a fruit bar, chewing gum, and cigarettes. There was also the D ration, essentially a dense, high-calorie chocolate bar specifically engineered to survive extreme heat without melting too easily, intended as an emergency food source when nothing else was available. Now, these rations were far from gourmet meals, and soldiers complained about them constantly, particularly about the repetitive nature of eating the same handful of canned meals day after day for weeks or even months at a time. But here's the key point. These rations were calorically dense, nutritionally balanced enough to sustain soldiers through intense physical exertion, and critically, they were consistently available. American logistics, particularly what became known as the Red Ball Express during the push across France, worked tirelessly to keep supply trucks moving food, fuel, and ammunition to frontline units, even under difficult conditions. This system was not perfect, and there were absolutely periods, especially during rapid advances or unexpected enemy offensives like the Battle of the Bulge, where American troops went without hot meals or sometimes without any resupply for days. But compared to what German soldiers were experiencing by 1944, American troops were eating like kings. German ration systems, in contrast, were built around a very different set of assumptions, and those assumptions became increasingly unrealistic as the war dragged on. Early in the war, German soldiers actually had reasonably solid rations, including hard bread, sausage, cheese, and margarine, supplemented by whatever local requisitioning could provide from occupied territories. This last part is important and reveals a fundamental difference in strategy. Germany's military planning often relied heavily on the idea that occupied territories would help feed the army, essentially living off the land and off the populations of conquered regions. This worked to some extent during the early rapid advances into places like Poland and France, where German forces could requisition food from local farms and stockpiles. But this strategy became far less sustainable as the war continued, particularly on the Eastern Front, where vast distances, destroyed infrastructure, and a scorched earth policy by retreating Soviet forces meant there was often simply nothing left to requisition. By the time we reached 1943 and 1944, German soldiers, especially those fighting on the Eastern Front, were experiencing severe and often desperate food shortages. Rations that were supposed to include meat, fat, and bread were frequently reduced to just bread, sometimes described by soldiers themselves in letters home as barely edible, along with whatever thin soup could be made from potatoes, cabbage, or other available vegetables. Meat became a rare luxury rather than a regular component of meals. Some German units resorted to eating horses that had died or been killed, not as some desperate emergency measure in an isolated incident, but as a fairly regular occurrence during periods of extended combat or encirclement, such as during the catastrophic Battle of Stalingrad, where soldiers were reduced to eating literally anything they could find, including in some of the most horrific accounts, resorting to eating leather and other non-food items just to have something in their stomachs. The contrast becomes even starker when we look at supply chain distances and infrastructure. American forces fighting in Western Europe benefited enormously from short, relatively secure supply lines running back to ports in places like Cherbourg and eventually other captured French ports, which connected to a massive transatlantic shipping operation bringing supplies directly from American factories and farms. German forces, especially on the Eastern Front, were dealing with supply lines stretching thousands of miles back into Germany itself, running through territory that was increasingly subject to partisan attacks, Allied bombing raids targeting railways and bridges, and the general chaos of a crumbling transportation infrastructure as the war turned against Germany. Allied bombing campaigns specifically targeted German railway networks and transportation hubs as a strategic priority precisely because military planners understood that disrupting supply lines would starve German forces of not just ammunition and fuel, but food as well. This bombing campaign became increasingly effective as the war progressed, meaning that even when food was technically available somewhere in the German supply chain, actually getting it to frontline soldiers became an enormous logistical challenge, sometimes an impossible one. There is also the matter of overall national food production and how it was allocated. Germany implemented strict rationing for its civilian population fairly early in the war, but even with civilians tightening their belts, there simply was not enough food production capacity to adequately supply both the civilian population and a massive military fighting on multiple fronts. The United States, by contrast, had such an enormous agricultural surplus that even with rationing implemented for civilians back home, involving things like sugar, meat, and gasoline, American agricultural output was still sufficient to feed both the domestic population reasonably well and maintain a steady, reliable flow of food to millions of soldiers stationed across multiple theaters of war simultaneously. American food science and packaging technology also played a significant, often underappreciated role in this disparity. The United States invested heavily in research focused on food preservation, packaging durability, and nutritional science as it applied to military rations, leading to improved canning techniques, waterproof packaging that could survive rough transport, and careful nutritional planning to ensure rations provided adequate calories even when soldiers ate the same packaged meals for weeks at a time. German ration development simply did not receive the same level of sustained industrial investment, particularly as the war progressed and German industry increasingly prioritized weapons production over food science. Cigarettes and small comfort items included in American rations also deserve mention, because morale played a real role in how soldiers experienced their food situation. American rations typically included cigarettes, chewing gum, and sometimes chocolate or candy, small items that, while not nutritionally significant, provided genuine psychological comfort to soldiers enduring the stress of combat. German rations occasionally included similar comfort items early in the war, but as resources became scarcer, these small morale-boosting extras became increasingly rare, adding to the broader sense among German troops that their situation was deteriorating both in terms of survival basics and simple quality of life comforts. It is also worth noting that American soldiers had access to something German soldiers largely did not, which was regular hot meals prepared by dedicated field kitchen units whenever tactical situations allowed for it. American field kitchens, when they could safely operate close enough to the front, prepared meals that included fresh bread, hot coffee, and sometimes even fresh meat when supply allowed, offering soldiers a welcome break from monotonous canned rations. German field kitchen operations existed as well, but became increasingly unreliable and under-resourced as the war progressed, particularly on the Eastern Front, where extreme distances and constant combat made establishing stable field kitchen operations far more difficult than it was for American forces operating with shorter, better protected supply lines in Western Europe. The psychological and physical toll of chronic malnutrition on German soldiers cannot be overstated either. Soldiers who are consistently underfed experience reduced physical stamina, weakened immune systems making them more susceptible to illness and infection, and diminished cognitive function affecting decision-making and reaction times in combat situations. Historical accounts and military analyses from the later years of the war frequently note that German units suffering from chronic food shortages showed measurably reduced combat effectiveness compared to earlier in the war, when rations, while never luxurious, were at least adequate to sustain soldiers through the physical demands of combat. By the final months of the war, the disparity between American and German food situations had become almost absurd in its scale. American soldiers advancing into German territory in early 1945 frequently encountered German soldiers, and in some cases entire units, who were willing to surrender partly because they were simply starving and knew that becoming a prisoner of war under American custody meant access to food, whereas continuing to fight meant continued hunger with increasingly little hope of resupply. This is a remarkable historical detail that speaks volumes about how significantly food supply, or the lack of it, shaped morale and decision-making in the final desperate months of the conflict in Europe. Looking at the bigger picture, this disparity in food supply between American and German forces was never really about individual soldiers or even individual commanders making better or worse decisions. It was fundamentally about industrial capacity, geographic distance, strategic priorities, and the compounding effects of a war that increasingly favored nations with secure, well-developed supply chains over those fighting multiple fronts with stretched, vulnerable logistics networks. The American soldier eating his canned meat and crackers was benefiting from an entire industrial and agricultural system operating safely thousands of miles from any battlefield, while the German soldier eating his thin soup was experiencing the direct consequences of a nation increasingly unable to sustain the basic needs of its military as the war ground on. In the end, food became just one more battlefield, where American industrial strength quietly but decisively outmatched German military capability, proving that wars are won not just through tactics and weapons, but through the less glamorous but absolutely essential work of keeping soldiers fed. There is one more piece of this story worth mentioning, and that is how differently each side approached the science of feeding soldiers over the long term. American military planners treated nutrition almost like an engineering problem, running studies on how many calories a soldier burned marching through mud, carrying equipment, or fighting in cold weather, and then designing rations specifically calibrated to replace those calories as efficiently as possible. This kind of systematic thinking extended to vitamin content as well, since military doctors had learned from earlier wars that soldiers eating monotonous diets for extended periods could develop deficiencies that weakened them, even if they were technically getting enough calories. As a result, American rations were often fortified with vitamins, something that sounds unremarkable today but represented a fairly advanced approach to military nutrition at the time. German military medicine simply did not have the luxury of applying this kind of long-term nutritional planning once the war turned against Germany and resources became scarce. Doctors and quartermasters were often forced into a reactive posture, scrambling to provide any calories at all rather than carefully balanced ones, and soldiers who might have recovered quickly from wounds under better nutritional conditions instead faced slower healing and a general physical fragility that made every hardship of the war just a little bit harder to survive. So, when people ask why American soldiers ate better than German soldiers during World War II, the honest answer is that it was never really a fair comparison to begin with. One side was drawing on the resources of a massive, untouched industrial and agricultural powerhouse operating an ocean away from the fighting, while the other side was trying to sustain a shrinking, increasingly desperate war effort on multiple fronts with supply lines that were being actively destroyed by enemy bombing and years of accumulated strain. The difference between a can of meat and crackers and a bowl of thin potato soup was not really about food at all. It was about which nation could still function as an industrial machine capable of supporting its soldiers, and by the final years of the war, that answer had become painfully clear to everyone involved, soldiers on both sides included.